A difficult question, but obviously the resort you were in had lots of nanny facilities and they weren't that expensive to use, and you both were professionals earning money. Another criticism that's put to you is, why didn't you just pay to have a nanny if you wanted to go out for dinner?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a question of money. We did what we thought was best in the kids' routines, and I think as parents we had a very good routine in terms of their whole bath, bed, story type thing. And I take your point, but for me, if your children are asleep upstairs in a bedroom and you're dining in the garden, you're out of sight and you can't hear them. And that's the similar thing to me.
Except I guess that most people's homes are secure.
Sure.
This was not a secure property. People could come in and off the street if they wanted to. That's where the criticism, I guess, comes at its most fierce towards you, is, you're intelligent people and you were certainly good parents. There's no one's questioning that from all accounts that we've all heard. It's just when you have people coming in and off a street like that and it's not your home and it's not really secure.
Again, I mean, I think it's back to the safety issue. We did not perceive an element of threat, and child abduction is so rare. Why would you ever have thought that someone was going to get into an apartment and steal your child? It just didn't enter our head. If it had, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, we've been through all these questions day in, day out.
Yeah.
Why, how, why? And I can only, say to myself, well, Kate, you felt really safe, and I know how much I love my children, and there's no way I'd have taken a risk.
I think the worst thing, though, about the focus on our behaviour, and, if we could change it, we would have. We can't change it, but it takes the focus away from the abductor.
In the days, weeks and years after Madeleine McCann vanished, the world watched, donated and hoped. Carnations, candles, vigils, money poured in from across the globe. In 2007 alone, according to public records, the Find Madeleine Fund received millions of pounds from the public, from bank transfers, online gifts and merchandising. Yet today, that fund's financial trail reads like a map of missing pieces, which leads us to the central question behind every donation and every headline. What really happened to all that money? Did it fund private detectives, legal fees, publicity campaigns? Did parts of it circle back to the family? Or were there expenditures that never fully matched the receipts? This video will not tell you what to believe. It will show you what is documented, the amounts raised, the claimed expenses, and where the public record ends and uncertainty begins. We'll start by going back to the night Madeleine disappeared, by revisiting why such a fund was even needed, and then walk through the financial structure, the receipts, the controversies, and what remains unseen. Because when public money is involved in one of the most watched missing person cases in history, the details matter. Let's begin by understanding who Kate and Jerry McCann were before the headlines. Then we'll move into how the fund was created, how donors gave, how the money was spent, and where gaps still remain. Praia da Luz, Portugal, May 3rd, 2007. A quiet family holiday at the Ocean Club Resort became one of the most reported missing child cases in modern history. 3-year-old Madeleine McCann disappeared from apartment 5A while her parents, Kate and Jerry, dined with friends at a nearby restaurant. Within hours, the case drew police attention, media saturation, and eventually, international sympathy. Jerry and Kate McCann were not celebrities before that night. Both were medical professionals. Jerry, a consultant cardiologist from Glasgow, and Kate, a GP from Liverpool, had built stable, respected careers. Friends described them as disciplined and close, a couple who valued family and faith. They had 3 children, Madeleine, born in 2003, and twins Sean and Amelie, born 2 years later. Madeleine's birth was the result of IVF treatment, something Kate later described as emotionally demanding but deeply rewarding. When they arrived in Portugal with their friends, the group later known as the Tapas 7, the trip was meant to be a relaxing break for young families. But in the days following Madeleine's disappearance, the McCanns' lives shifted from private to public in a way no one could have imagined. From the very first appeals, media coverage was intense. The story spread across Europe and beyond. News channels ran 24-hour updates. Tabloids published daily speculation. Photographs of Madeleine filled front pages across the UK. The public responded with shock and then with generosity. Donations began to pour in. Messages, checks, small transfers, all meant to help in the search. The McCanns became the face of a campaign that was at once deeply human and deeply scrutinized. But with the scale of global attention came logistical reality. Offers of money, assistance, and rewards needed coordination. Private detectives needed to be hired, legal advice sought, and media management handled. In the weeks after Madeleine disappeared, this growing tide of support, both emotional and financial, needed structure. That's how the idea of a dedicated fund began to take shape. Not as a charity in the strict legal sense, but as a limited company, one designed to manage donations and direct resources toward the search. The fund would soon become one of the most publicized, and later one of the most questioned, aspects of the Madeleine McCann case. And to understand why, we need to look at how it was formed, who ran it, and how the first pounds and euros were spent. In the early weeks following Madeleine McCann's disappearance, public attention was fixed on the search. Posters, appeals, interviews, and a growing wave of global sympathy. The Find Madeleine campaign was everywhere, and the newly created fund became a central tool in that mission. Media outlets across the UK and beyond followed every move the McCanns made, portraying them as parents enduring an unimaginable tragedy. But as the summer of 2007 went on, the tone of coverage began to shift. Journalists who had once written with compassion started to ask quieter, more skeptical questions. Why were there no confirmed sightings? Why did the investigation seem to be stalling? Portuguese police, the Polícia Judiciária, or PJ, were also reaching a turning point. By August and into September, investigators in Portimão were beginning to view the case differently. Despite extensive searches around Praia da Luz, no evidence pointed to an abductor. The physical evidence at apartment 5A didn't fit the description of a break-in or forced entry. Windows and shutters appeared undamaged. The investigation that had begun as a presumed abduction was now widening in scope. The PJ had spent months cross-checking statements from the McCanns and their friends, the group the media called the Tapas 7. As they compared details, investigators noticed contradictions in timelines and movements. The supposed window of opportunity for an intruder seemed increasingly narrow. Publicly, the McCanns continued to campaign for information and appeal for witnesses. Privately, however, the Portuguese police were preparing for a new phase. What had started as a search for a missing child was slowly becoming a closer examination of the people who had been with her that night. By early September, the optimism surrounding the Find Madeleine campaign had dimmed. Behind the scenes, the investigation was shifting focus, not toward strangers, but toward inconsistencies closer to home. As the Portuguese investigation deepened, detectives began identifying inconsistencies within the witness statements given by the McCanns and their friends, the so-called Tapas 7. The group's recollections of the night of May 3rd didn't always align. Specific details, like who checked on which child and at what exact time, varied from person to person. When police attempted to reconstruct the events of that evening, the timelines didn't match up as cleanly as expected. One of the earliest questions raised by the PJ was about the supposed break-in. Kate McCann had said that the bedroom window was open and the shutters were raised when she discovered Madeleine missing. But when investigators examined the window, there were no signs of forced entry. The shutters and frame were intact, with no damage that would suggest tampering. The conclusion was simple but significant. If an intruder had entered or exited through that window, they had done so without leaving a single trace. Attention also turned to phone records and communication patterns. Detectives reviewed mobile activity from the McCanns and their close circle, noting certain gaps and missing call data that were later explored further in the technical analysis. Behavioral observations were added to the files, from the couple's emotional state to how they interacted with police and media. In Kate McCann's early interviews, officers noted a degree of tension. When asked detailed procedural questions about the night of May 3rd, particularly surrounding the window, the door, and her movements in the apartment, her responses were sometimes hesitant. Later, during a formal interview session, she declined to answer a series of key questions, a choice that the PJ recorded in full. By late July and early August, the investigation entered a new, more technical phase. Forensic teams collected samples from apartment 5A, the Renault Scenic hire car the McCanns had rented weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, and various items of clothing. DNA traces were compared, catalogued, and sent for analysis. As the investigation progressed, forensic evidence became central to the Portuguese police's line of inquiry. In late July 2007, 2 specially trained British sniffer dogs, Eddie, a cadaver dog, and Keeler, a blood detection dog, were brought to Portugal by specialists from South Yorkshire Police to assist in the search for physical clues. When deployed in apartment 5A, where the McCanns had stayed, both dogs gave alerts. Eddie, the cadaver dog, signaled the scent of human remains in specific areas, behind the living room sofa, on a piece of Kate McCann's clothing, and on one of Madeleine's soft toys. Keeler, the blood detection dog, separately indicated traces of blood in the same general area near the sofa. These findings were meticulously documented by the Policia Judiciaria. The dogs were then used to inspect the Renault Scenic hire car that the McCanns began using several weeks after Madeleine's disappearance. Both dogs again gave alerts. Eddie to the scent of cadaver, and Keeler to possible blood traces in the vehicle's boot compartment. Subsequent forensic tests were ordered on samples collected from these sites. Laboratory analysis at the Forensic Science Service in Birmingham reported that the DNA traces found in the car showed a partial match to Madeleine's genetic profile. However, it was not a full profile and therefore could not be used as definitive proof. The report emphasized that mixed DNA samples and low-level readings made it impossible to determine their origin with certainty. Despite the cautious interpretation from British forensic scientists, the alerts had a significant impact on the investigation. For the Portuguese police, the combination of cadaver scent, blood indications, and partial DNA similarity pointed toward a possible alternative hypothesis, that Madeleine had died in the apartment and her body had been moved. The findings created a rift between the PJ and British investigators. While the PJ viewed the dog alerts and partial DNA as potential evidence of concealment, the British team advised restraint, highlighting that such results were not conclusive in isolation. On the 6th of September 2007, Kate McCann was formally interviewed by Portuguese police as part of their intensified inquiry. During this session, investigators presented her with a structured list of 48 questions. These questions focused on specific inconsistencies and gaps in the accounts provided by both the McCanns and their friends. The inquiries sought to clarify critical details: the timing of the evening checks on the children, the position of the bedroom window and shutters, who first noticed them open, and what steps were taken immediately after the discovery. Other questions concerned whether Madeleine had woken up earlier in the week, if there had been any previous security concerns, and why the bedroom door and curtains were positioned differently from what others recalled. Kate McCann responded to only one of these questions, confirming her identity. For all the others, she exercised her legal right to remain silent. This was a permitted choice under Portuguese law, especially given that she had been advised she was under increasing scrutiny as part of the inquiry. Her refusal to answer was noted officially in the police files. Within Portugal, it drew public attention and media speculation, as many interpreted the silence as resistance to cooperation. However, from a legal standpoint, the McCann's representatives emphasized that Kate's decision followed direct advice from her lawyers and was consistent with her right to avoid self-incrimination during an active investigation. On 7 September 2007, Portuguese authorities officially designated both Kate and Jerry McCann as arguidos, formal suspects in the disappearance of their daughter. This decision followed weeks of forensic analysis, discrepancies in witness statements, and Kate's interview the previous day. Under Portuguese law, arguido status does not equate to being charged with a crime. Instead, it formally identifies a person as being under suspicion, granting them both additional rights and obligations within the judicial process. As arguidos, the McCanns were now entitled to legal representation during questioning, the right to remain silent, and the right to be informed of the evidence against them. The designation also permitted investigators to conduct further searches and pursue more direct lines of inquiry involving the couple. For the Policia Judiciaria, this move was procedural, a legal step enabling them to explore all possible explanations. But in the public sphere, the effect was far greater. The announcement made international headlines within hours. Newspapers across Europe shifted tone, framing the McCanns not only as grieving parents, but as central figures in an unfolding criminal investigation. The shift in perception was immediate. Public opinion became divided between those who saw the decision as an overreach by Portuguese authorities and those who began to question the original abduction narrative. Donations to the Find Madeleine Fund began to slow, and media coverage grew more cautious, focusing increasingly on the investigation rather than the family's appeals. By early autumn 2007, the McCanns had gone from the center of a global sympathy campaign to the subjects of one of the most scrutinized police inquiries in Europe, a transformation that would shape the next stage of their public and legal journey. Shortly after being named arguidos, Kate and Jerry McCann left Portugal and returned to the United Kingdom with their 2 remaining children. Their departure was permitted under Portuguese law, though it drew international attention and varying interpretations in the press. In public statements, both parents maintained their innocence and expressed frustration with the direction of the investigation. They argued that the Policia Judiciaria had misunderstood or overemphasized certain forensic findings while failing to pursue alternative leads. Their legal representatives in both countries reiterated that no direct evidence linked them to Madeleine's disappearance. Back in the UK, the McCanns continued to campaign for new lines of inquiry and to defend their actions. Meanwhile, tensions between the Portuguese and British investigative teams grew, particularly over the interpretation of DNA evidence and the handling of media communications. By mid-2008, after reviewing the collected evidence, Portugal's Attorney General determined that there was insufficient proof to support any criminal charges against the McCanns. The case was formally archived, and both Kate and Jerry's arguido status was lifted. Though the official designation was removed, the public perception shaped during that period left a lasting impact. The couple's time as arguidos marked a defining phase of the investigation, one that shifted the global conversation around the case and continued to influence every subsequent development that followed. Now let's go back to the weeks following Madeleine's disappearance and the Find Madeleine funding. Public sympathy quickly turned into a wave of financial support. Donations came from across the United Kingdom and abroad, with people sending money through banks, online transfers, and even checks addressed directly to the family. Within just days, the Find Madeleine Fund, formally registered as Leaving No Stone Unturned Limited, began collecting significant sums to assist in the search efforts. Public records and statements from the fund's directors indicate that within the first year, more than £1.8 million was raised. This came from a combination of online donations, street collections, media appeals, and sales of merchandise such as wristbands and t-shirts bearing Madeleine's image. The fund was not registered as a charity, but as a limited company, giving it greater flexibility in how it could use the money. The McCanns and their representatives said this decision was made so the fund could hire private investigators and manage legal costs without the restrictions attached to charitable organizations. High-profile donations added to the momentum. Notable contributors included celebrities, businesses, and ordinary citizens moved by the story. Companies like Iceland Foods contributed publicly, while media outlets helped amplify appeals. The fund also received money from events held in churches, schools, and local councils. The transparency reports published early on gave breakdowns showing that a portion of the funds went toward administrative costs, but the majority was reportedly directed to search-related expenses. Media coverage played a central role in maintaining public interest. Each televised interview, newspaper front page, or anniversary special often coincided with surges in donations. The McCann's spokesperson at the time frequently updated the press about the fund's growth, emphasizing that it was being used to pursue leads, print posters, and coordinate search operations. However, as months passed, the financial management of the fund began to attract scrutiny. Reporters and some members of the public started questioning how the money was being spent, particularly as the Portuguese investigation slowed and private investigators took over much of the search work. Even so, during that early phase, the fund remained a symbol of public goodwill. It represented both hope for Madeleine's recovery and a tangible way for people to express solidarity with her family. By the end of the first year, Leaving No Stone Unturned Limited had become one of the most publicly recognized fundraising entities in the UK. The money it received had transformed the search from a local police case into an international private investigation effort, setting the stage for what would later become a long and controversial financial story surrounding the Madeleine McCann case. As the Find Madeleine Fund entered its second year, questions began to emerge about how the donations were being spent. Public records, media reports, and the fund's own limited disclosures provide an outline of its early expenditures. According to the company's first published accounts, roughly £815,000 was spent in the fund's first year of operation. These costs were divided among investigative fees, legal advice, media and campaign expenses, and basic administration. The largest single category of spending was related to private investigators. The fund initially hired Método 3, a Barcelona-based detective agency, in late 2007. Their contract reportedly cost around £50,000 per month, with the promise that their team would continue searching across Spain and Portugal. Método 3 became one of the fund's most visible private contractors, appearing frequently in the media with updates about possible sightings and leads. However, their involvement later ended amid questions about the effectiveness of their methods and the accuracy of some public claims. Other expenses included public relations and communications. The McCanns employed a professional PR representative, Clarence Mitchell, who coordinated interviews, press conferences, and media briefings. Reports from the time suggest that some of these PR costs were covered by the fund, while others were privately financed or supported through external assistance. Maintaining a visible media presence was seen as essential to keeping Madeleine's case in public view, and much of the fund's activity focused on ensuring her story remained in the headlines. Legal fees were another significant expenditure. As public attention intensified and legal challenges arose, the McCanns sought representation in both Portugal and the UK. They engaged lawyers and legal consultants to navigate the complexities of cross-border cooperation between Portuguese and British authorities, as well as to address defamation issues with the press. According to later fund reports, a portion of the donations was used for these legal costs, which included advice on libel cases and responses to press allegations. Administrative costs also featured in the annual accounts, covering bank charges, office supplies, accounting, and website maintenance. While these figures were comparatively small, they were still listed to maintain transparency with donors. One particular expenditure that attracted public debate was the temporary payment of part of the McCann's mortgage. a decision confirmed by the fund in mid-2007. The rationale, according to the board, was that the parents had taken unpaid leave to assist in the ongoing search for their daughter and needed financial stability during that period. The payments were later stopped following criticism in the media. The fund's directors, which included friends and colleagues of the McCanns, defended all expenditures as legitimate and necessary to continue the search. They emphasized that independent accountants reviewed the finances annually and that the accounts were filed with Companies House in compliance with UK regulations. By the second year, additional spending included contracts with new private investigation firms such as Oakley International and Halligan's Red Defence International, both based in the UK and the US. The fees for these firms were substantial. Oakley International's short-lived contract alone was reportedly worth more than £300,000. Each investigative change reflected a shift in the fund's operational strategy, moving the focus from local searches in Portugal to a wider international investigation. Overall, the fund's expenditures during its first years combined practical search efforts, professional services, and media outreach. Public scrutiny intensified because of the high sums involved, but on paper, each major cost category could be tied back to the stated mission, finding Madeleine McCann and supporting the family during the search. As the years went on, however, the proportion of funds spent on active searches began to decline, while more resources were directed toward legal and operational maintenance, a shift that would later attract growing debate about transparency and the long-term purpose of the fund. As the Find Madeleine Fund continued its operations, public attention gradually turned from sympathy to scrutiny. While the fund had been established with overwhelming support, it soon faced growing criticism about how donations were managed, what results had been achieved, and whether the spending aligned with its original purpose. One of the earliest controversies arose in late 2007, when it was revealed that part of the fund's money had been used to pay the McCann's mortgage for a limited time. The decision, which the board said was necessary to allow the parents to focus full-time on the search, quickly became a topic of debate. Donors who had contributed, believing their money would go directly towards search efforts, questioned whether such personal expenses were appropriate. Following public backlash, the board announced that mortgage assistance had been discontinued and that all future spending would directly support the campaign or investigation. A second point of contention was the hiring of private investigators. The fund's contracts with detective agencies such as Metodo Free, Oakley International, and Red Defence International drew criticism due to the large sums involved and the limited tangible outcomes. Metodo Tre, in particular, had made several high-profile public statements, including claims that Madeleine would be found by Christmas 2007. That later proved inaccurate. Oakley International's director, Kevin Halligan, was later arrested in the United States on unrelated fraud charges, which further damaged the fund's reputation. Each of these episodes fed the perception that large portions of the donations were being spent on ineffective or poorly vetted operations. Transparency also became a recurring issue. The Find Madeleine Fund was not a registered charity, but a private limited company, officially titled Leaving No Stone Unturned Limited. This distinction meant it was not subject to the same public disclosure requirements or oversight as charities under the UK's Charity Commission. While annual accounts were filed with Companies House, these provided only high-level summaries rather than detailed breakdowns of how each pound was spent. This structural choice, though legally permissible, led some members of the public and media commentators to accuse the fund of lacking accountability. Throughout these controversies, spokespeople for the McCanns consistently defended the fund's integrity. They stated that all money was used strictly for the purpose of finding Madeleine or defending the family's legal position in connection with that search. Clarence Mitchell, acting as the family's media representative, reiterated that professional accountants oversaw the finances and that independent auditors had approved the fund's reports. Despite these reassurances, criticism persisted, particularly from sections of the press and online forums. Some questioned whether hiring media advisors and PR consultants fit the fund's mission, while others raised concerns that the high-profile publicity campaigns were overshadowing the investigative side. In response, the McCanns argued that keeping Madeleine's case visible in the public eye was essential, as media awareness continued to generate tips and new leads. Disputes also emerged over donation management and public communication. At various times, reports circulated suggesting that not all donors understood that their contributions were going to a private fund rather than a registered charity. The board later clarified this point on the official website, explaining the legal structure and emphasizing that the decision had been made early on to give the fund greater operational flexibility in pursuing international leads. In the following years, occasional legal challenges and defamation cases involving the McCanns further increased costs associated with the fund. When the couple pursued libel actions against newspapers and former investigators, some reports indicated that related legal fees may have been supported by the fund. These expenses reignited public debate over where the line should be drawn between search-related and personal legal costs. Audits and official disclosures remained limited. While annual summaries continued to be filed, no independent public audit was ever released in full detail. The available documents, though compliant with UK corporate law, did not fully satisfy critics who wanted to see itemized accounts. Supporters of the fund countered that full disclosure could compromise operational security or sensitive investigative information. By the end of its second year, the Find Madeleine Fund existed under a dual perception. To supporters, it was a vital lifeline sustaining an ongoing international search. To critics, it was an opaque operation whose expenditures did not match the scale of the donations it had received. These conflicting views would continue to define public discussion around the fund for years to come, even as official investigations began winding down and the family shifted their focus to long-term legal and awareness efforts. As years passed and public attention toward Madeleine's case began to fade, the Find Madeleine Fund gradually transitioned from a high-profile global campaign to a quieter, long-term operation. Donations, once steady and substantial, declined sharply after the peak media coverage of 2007 to 2008. By 2009, financial reports filed with UK Companies House showed that income had dropped from hundreds of thousands of pounds in the first year to only a small fraction of that amount annually. The fund's spending also shifted accordingly. Early expenditures on private investigations, PR, and legal representation gave way to more limited administrative and awareness activities. The McCanns continued to emphasize that the fund's primary goal, to leave no stone unturned, remained unchanged. However, the scale of its operations became smaller and more focused, reflecting the reality of reduced financial inflows. By 2011, the fund reported reserves of approximately £450,000, a significant decrease from the initial peak of over £2 million raised in its first months. This period also coincided with the launch of Operation Grange, the Metropolitan Police's formal review of the case, announced by then Prime Minister David Cameron. With British authorities now leading an official re-examination, the fund's private search activities paused, and a portion of its remaining money was used to support legal and logistical coordination with law enforcement. Over the next decade, the fund maintained its legal status as a private limited company under the name Leaving No Stone Unturned Limited, renewing its registration annually. However, reports indicate that by 2020, its available balance had fallen to around £180,000, primarily used to sustain the website, communication costs, and legal fees associated with ongoing proceedings in Portugal. During this period, donations became largely sporadic and symbolic, often linked to anniversary appeals or renewed bursts of media attention. The fund's official website continued to provide updates, thanking the public for support and reiterating that Madeleine's search was ongoing. Nonetheless, without new evidence or major developments, public engagement steadily declined. Questions also arose about whether the fund would eventually wind down. Official filings showed that the McCanns and close family members continued to serve as directors, ensuring its legal continuity. The fund's mission statement, to secure Madeleine's safe return, remained unchanged, but its scope had narrowed to managing communications and assisting with case-related obligations rather than funding new investigative initiatives. By the early 2020s, the Find Madeleine Fund existed largely as a symbolic entity, preserving the legal and financial framework established in 2007, but operating at a minimal level. Annual financial returns showed modest income, minimal expenses, and no new major investigative contracts. In recent years, with both public interest and donations reduced, the fund has functioned primarily as a reserve resource, ensuring that if credible new information or leads ever emerged, funds would be available to respond quickly. It continues to remain registered, transparent in its filings, and active on paper, but a far cry from the large-scale campaign it once was in the immediate aftermath of Madeleine's disappearance. The decline in activity reflected a broader reality. As time passed and no definitive breakthroughs emerged, the fund that had once symbolized public hope gradually became a quiet administrative body, still existing, still reporting, but no longer at the center of the international conversation it once defined. From its inception, the Find Madeleine Fund operated under the legal framework of a private limited company rather than a registered charity, a deliberate choice made by the McCanns and their legal advisors. This structure allowed the fund to retain greater flexibility over how money could be spent, unlike charitable organisations, which are subject to stricter external oversight by the UK Charity Commission. However, this decision also sparked questions from the public and media about how the fund's finances were monitored. The company was officially registered under the name Leaving No Stone Unturned Limited, with Kate and Jerry McCann among its directors, alongside family friends, legal advisors, and a small number of independent trustees. According to the company's founding documents, its stated purpose was to secure Madeleine's safe return and to support related search, legal, and awareness efforts. Each year, the fund filed annual financial statements with Companies House detailing income, expenditures, and closing balances. While these filings met the legal requirements for transparency, they were limited in scope. The report summarized spending under broad categories such as search and investigation costs, legal fees, or campaign expenses, without listing detailed itemized expenditures. This general reporting style led to continued debate about how closely fund activity was scrutinized. Throughout its operation, representatives of the fund, including spokespersons and family members, stated publicly that independent auditors reviewed the accounts annually. The accounting firm Hayes Macintyre, LLP, handled early audits, and the McCanns emphasized that all major spending decisions required board approval. Despite these assurances, calls for greater openness persisted, particularly during the periods when donations were highest and when questions arose about the role of private investigators and legal teams paid through the fund. Critics argued that the lack of charity-level oversight left too much discretion in the hands of the directors, especially since several were personally connected to the McCanns. Supporters countered that the board's composition ensured trust and efficiency, allowing funds to be deployed quickly without bureaucratic delays. Public confidence in the fund fluctuated over the years. Early on, it was seen as a compassionate response to a family tragedy. Later, as media scrutiny intensified and the McCanns faced legal battles, transparency became a recurring theme in press coverage. Still, Official filings showed no evidence of misuse, and the fund remained compliant with all corporate regulations. In essence, the Find Madeleine Fund maintained a legal level of accountability, but one that operated in a grey area between personal initiative and public trust. It was not a charity answerable to a regulator, nor a purely private account. It existed as something in between, transparent enough to remain legitimate, but not open enough to fully satisfy every question raised about where, how, and why the money was spent. The story of the Find Madeleine Fund is a reminder of how tragedy, hope, and public generosity can intertwine in complicated ways. What began as a movement to leave no stone unturned grew into one of the most recognized missing person campaigns in modern history, raising millions, drawing global attention, and sparking ongoing debate about how such efforts should be managed. Over the years, the fund's legacy has become twofold. On one hand, it represents the determination of a family who refused to give up searching for their daughter. On the other, it has raised the lasting questions about transparency, accountability, and how the public's goodwill should be handled when emotion and money meet under global scrutiny. While official reports show the fund operated within legal bounds, the lack of full transparency has kept curiosity alive, and the questions remain. How should funds like this be managed in future cases? And has the public's trust in high-profile appeals like this changed because of it? What do you think? Was the Find Madeleine Fund a necessary tool in the search for answers, or did it lose its way under pressure and controversy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. If you found this investigation informative, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, turn on notifications, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the Madeleine McCann case files.